I am Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. I am the beginning and the end, the one who formed Ruth in her mother's womb and numbered every day of her life before one of them came to be. Ruth's life was not without pain, storms, or danger. She was not spared from sorrow, but she was never alone. From the moment of her first cry to her final breath at 110 years old, I was there, watching, guiding, shielding her from death, even when she didn't see me. There were 10 moments, 10 near deaths, when darkness tried to steal her, but I said, not yet, because no one leaves this world unless I, the author of life, allow it. This is not just the story of a woman named Ruth. This is the story of my faithfulness, my protection, and the purpose I placed within her. Let me show you how I walked with her, through fire, flood, sickness, and silence, until the day I welcomed her home. I remember the night Ruth was born. The air in the pine woods was heavy with heat, and even the stars seemed restless. Her mother cried out in labor inside a fragile wooden cabin, her hands gripping the sides of the old bed while her husband prayed beside her. There were no doctors, no machines, only flickering lantern light and the trembling faith of 2 people who had waited years for a child. I was there, unseen, but very near. I had chosen Ruth long before that moment. And as she took her first breath in the humid air of rural Florida, I smiled, knowing the story I would write with her life. But while her parents rejoiced over her tiny fingers and dark eyes, death had already begun its pursuit. Just beyond the hills, a spark had caught in the dry brush. The wind, wild and warm, fed it like hunger. Within minutes, the forest behind the cabin was ablaze, a wall of fire stretching toward them, unseen and silent in the dark. Flames licked the trunks of tall trees, leapt from branch to branch, and swallowed everything in their path. The animals fled. The sky turned the color of blood. No one knew the danger was coming. No one except me. I stood in the heart of that fire. I felt the fury of it. I knew what it came to do. The blaze had been set by carelessness miles away, but it had found a straight path to Ruth. The enemy always tries to destroy life at its beginning, especially when that life carries purpose. And Ruth's life would carry a purpose greater than anyone could have imagined. That's why the fire came quickly, furiously, a threat wrapped in silence. Inside the cabin, her mother began to notice the scent of smoke. Her father stepped outside and saw the orange glow lighting the sky like a sunrise from the wrong direction. Panic gripped him. He screamed for help, but there was no one to hear. No phones, no roads, no time. He rushed back inside, gathering his wife and newborn in his arms, his hands shaking. The fire would reach them in minutes, maybe seconds. Every human instinct told them to run. But there was nowhere to go. The heat was already pressing against the walls. And so they prayed. That's when I moved. I reached into the wind. I spoke to it, not in desperation but with authority. I redirected it. The flames bent. They curved around the cabin as if repelled by an invisible shield. The trees closest to the house blackened but did not burn. Sparks fell but vanished before touching the roof. Ruth's mother wept, thinking it was luck. Her father stood silent, thinking perhaps the fire had simply spared them. But I knew better. I had drawn a line the fire could not cross. As the night wore on, the fire raged through fields and thickets, burning everything but the little cabin tucked beneath the oaks. It was not spared because of good fortune. It was spared because of destiny. Ruth, only hours old, would never remember that night. She would never know how close death came, but I remembered. I held her that night, wrapped not only in cloth, but in my promise. You see, the enemy saw Ruth's future just as I did. He saw her voice, her compassion, the prayers she would whisper in the dark, and the people she would comfort. He saw the children she would raise, the broken she would mend, the tears she would wipe from other faces. He saw the strength in her spirit, the quiet fire in her soul, and so he tried to end it before it began. But I said no. I had already written her days, and that night was not her last. The fire died with the dawn. Smoke clung to the trees for days. Ashes rained like grey snow. When neighbors finally reached the cabin, they found everything around it blackened, but not the home, not the family, not Ruth. I watched as her mother held her tighter, kissed her forehead, and whispered thanks. She didn't know to whom she was speaking, but I heard her. I always hear. And so the first page of Ruth's story was marked by fire. Not by what it destroyed, but by what it could not take. That's how her life began, wrapped in danger, preserved by grace, cradled in my hands before she even knew my name. And though the flames retreated that night, they would return in other forms. But so would I. I never left. I never would. Do you see it now? Even from the beginning, her life was not ordinary. It was watched, it was protected, it was chosen. And that's only the beginning. Let me show you what came next. Ruth was 5 the first time she truly felt free. She had grown strong and curious, her feet always quicker than her thoughts. The summer sun had returned with its usual force, and the fields behind her house had grown wild with grass and golden weeds that tickled her knees as she ran. Her laughter echoed between the trees, and her hair danced behind her like fire. Her parents worked nearby, close enough to hear her if she screamed, but she had no reason to. At least, not yet. That morning, I watched her skip down the worn path toward the creek, the one her father always told her to avoid unless he was with her. But she was 5, and the world felt safe. The dragonflies shimmered over the water, and the breeze was warm against her face. She wasn't disobeying, not intentionally. She simply wanted to see the turtles sunbathing on the rocks again. She wanted to dip her toes in the coolness and feel brave. I saw her coming long before she reached the clearing, but I also saw what she didn't. Coiled beneath the tall grass just inches from the trail, hidden like a shadow with fangs, a cottonmouth, thick, venomous and still. Its body blended with the earth, but its head was raised slightly, sensing the vibrations of her little feet. It had already been disturbed earlier that day and was ready to strike. Ruth, unaware, danced closer with every step. She giggled and reached down to pick a wildflower, placing her small hand just inches from death. I could have shouted. I could have sent a loud wind or broken a branch to startle her away. But I wanted her to notice something gentler, something she would remember, not fear, so I stirred her heart. I placed a thought in her young mind, one she wouldn't question. Her hand froze. She tilted her head and looked down just slightly to the side. Her eyes locked on the snake's open mouth, fangs gleaming like thorns, and for the first time in her life, she was silent. Her breath caught. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She just stared. And the snake stared back, frozen in the tension between its instinct and my authority. Then I whispered to her again, softly, "Step back." She did, slowly. 1 step, then 2. Then she turned and ran as fast as her legs would carry her, back toward her home, her flower forgotten in the dirt beside danger. She never saw the way the snake recoiled and slithered back into the tall grass after she left. She didn't need to. She crashed into her father's arms, her voice trembling, her story pouring out in pieces. He ran to the creek with a shovel, furious and afraid, but found nothing, just grass, just sunlight, just silence. He scolded her gently, held her tightly, and never truly knew how close he came to losing her. But I knew. I had been there, between her skin and the fangs. I had drawn the invisible line once again. That night, Ruth was quieter than usual. She looked out her window longer before bed, her young mind trying to understand what had happened. She couldn't name it, but she felt it. She had been watched, protected, held. That would be the first time she wondered if someone was out there, not far, but close. Someone who saw her even when no one else did. The enemy doesn't always come in roaring fire. Sometimes he waits in the grass. Sometimes he disguises death in silence, hoping you won't notice until it's too late. But I notice. I always notice, and every time the enemy came for Ruth, I was already standing between him and her, even in the shape of a small girl with muddy feet and a skipping heart. You might think a moment like that would be rare, but in Ruth's life, the enemy kept coming, because I had something greater planned for her. Her path was long and her calling deep. She would grow into a woman of strength, of faith, of compassion, but even then her journey would carry shadows. Still, no matter how dark the way became, I was always the light she didn't know she was following. Ruth was 13 when her body first betrayed her. The cheerful girl who once outran the wind began to slow. At first, it was just a cough. Soft, forgettable, nothing to worry about. She would clear her throat, wave it off, and say she was fine. That's the kind of girl she was. Strong, quiet, determined not to be a burden. But I could feel what was coming before the doctors even heard a sound. There, hidden deep in her lungs, a quiet storm was building, one the world couldn't see. But I saw it. Day by day, the cough deepened. Her steps grew shorter, her breath thinner, her laughter faded into silence. Her parents watched in helpless confusion as their daughter, who once climbed trees and raced shadows, now struggled to climb the stairs to her room. They took her to the small-town clinic. The doctor listened, frowned, and said it was likely just a cold. Rest, fluids, time. But time was not on their side. What they didn't know was that pneumonia had begun to flood her lungs like a rising tide. With every breath, less oxygen reached her blood. At night she would lie awake, her chest heavy, eyes wide in the dark. Her heart cried out, even though her mouth never did. And I heard her. Even in her silence, I heard her. One night, her breathing slowed, too slow. Her parents, asleep in the next room, had no idea how close death had drawn. She turned her face toward the window, her skin pale with effort. And that's when I came near. Not with lightning or a voice from heaven, but with presence. I sat at her bedside, the same way I did when she was 5. I placed my hand over her chest, and I breathed. It wasn't a miracle anyone could see. No light filled the room, no trumpet sounded. But her lungs, weak and burdened, began to clear. Bit by bit, the infection lost its grip. The fever cooled. Her breath steadied. In the silence of that room, I fought a battle no one witnessed. And when dawn came, Ruth opened her eyes. Still tired, still weak, but alive. Not by chance, by design. Her parents brought her back to the clinic a few days later. This time, a different nurse took her vitals. Her eyes widened at the results. She must have turned a corner, they said. A recovery like this, it's rare. But I knew it wasn't a corner. It was a covering. I had shielded her from what the world had missed, because her time had not yet come. Her purpose had not yet blossomed. I was still writing her story, and death had no permission to take the pen from my hand. In the weeks that followed, Ruth slowly regained her strength. Her cheeks regained color. Her laughter returned like spring after a long frost. She never told anyone about that night. She wasn't sure how to explain the feeling of being held when no one was there. But from that moment on, she prayed more often, quiet, simple prayers, not for things, but for nearness, for me. There is something sacred in a storm no one sees, the kind that comes not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that waits in the lungs of a child, hoping to go unnoticed until it's too late. But I do not miss what others overlook. I saw Ruth. I always saw her. And I had already decided she would live, because there was more ahead, much more. She had yet to step into the deepest waters. She had yet to face the moment where death would try to claim her not with sickness or silence, but with force. And when that day came, the river would rise. But so would I. Ruth was 19 when the river called her. It wasn't a day of danger, not on the surface. The sun was high, the air thick with the sounds of summer. Her younger brother, barely 10, had begged her to take him down to the riverbend after lunch. She agreed with a smile, grabbed a towel, and warned him not to run ahead, though he always did. The river wasn't far from the house, a short walk past rows of cypress and brush, but that day its calm surface hid a deeper pull. She had always been strong in the water. She had swum in that river since she was a child, diving off rocks, racing with cousins, floating on her back under the open sky. But that day, the current was different. Recent rains had swollen the banks, and beneath the muddy surface, the undertow waited like something hungry. Still, Ruth didn't hesitate. When her brother slipped on the slick edge and vanished with a splash, she ran faster than thought and dove in without a cry. The river swallowed her. For a few seconds, everything turned to confusion, bubbles, branches, shadows below. She saw his arms flailing just ahead, his mouth open in panic. She reached him. That part she managed. She wrapped her arms around his small frame, lifted his head above the water, but in doing so she let herself sink. The current pulled at her legs like invisible hands. The weight of him dragged her deeper, and for the first time Ruth felt the cold grip of fear. She was strong, but not strong enough. Her lungs burned, her heart pounded, her limbs thrashed, but the current only spun her further. Her brother cried out, barely able to stay above water. And beneath him Ruth slipped under, no longer fighting, just falling. That's when I entered the water. Not in form, not in flash, but in power. I reached through the current, the chaos, the cold. I cradled her body in the deep, just before she sank into unconsciousness. I lifted her to the surface like breath itself. Her brother, too exhausted to swim, suddenly found footing on a submerged rock, one I had placed there long ago for this very moment. He coughed and sobbed and screamed her name. She broke through the surface, gasping, eyes wide, confused, alive. They made it to the shore, crawling like newborn deer, shaking from exhaustion. Her brother clung to her, sobbing into her chest, while she stared back at the river. The same river she had known all her life, now looking like something foreign. She whispered, "Thank you," though she didn't yet know to whom she was speaking. But I heard it. I always hear it. Later, when she told her parents, she downplayed the danger. She didn't want to scare them. That's the kind of woman Ruth was becoming. Brave, protective, steady in a storm. But I knew what had truly happened that day. I knew the plan the enemy had tried to carry out in the depths, and I knew the miracle that now beat within her chest like a second heartbeat. Drowning is more than water. It's the moment life slips beneath the surface, when strength runs out and breath disappears. And it comes in many forms: grief, fear, regret. But on that day, I showed Ruth what it meant to be rescued when the world goes silent. I showed her that I don't just calm storms, I enter them. She would carry that moment with her, buried deep, the memory of weightlessness in the current. But it would make her stronger. It would give her a tenderness toward those drowning in their own way. She would speak life to the weary. And she would never again look at water without remembering the one who pulled her from it, because that wasn't the last time death would reach for Ruth. No, it would come again, this time wearing a different face. And she would need me once more, not in the wildness of water, but in the shadows of night, when evil followed her footsteps. Ruth was 26 when danger put on a face. By then, she had grown into the kind of woman who carried quiet strength wherever she went. Her life was simple: work, family, evening walks on the dirt roads that ran between the tall pines of her small Florida town. She loved the quiet, the space, the hush of dusk, when the sky melted into colors and the air turned soft. That's where she felt closest to peace. But peace doesn't always mean safety. And one night, something darker waited in the stillness. She had just left her friend's house after supper. The gravel road back to her own home was familiar, comforting. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Crickets sang. Her shoes crunched over the stones as she walked alone, holding a sweater close to her chest. She didn't notice the truck that passed slowly behind her earlier, or the way it stopped just around the bend. But I did. The man inside didn't know her. He didn't need to. He had already decided what he came to take. Evil doesn't always come with reason. Sometimes it comes simply because it's looking for something to devour. He stepped out of the truck, quiet, calculated, walking behind her in the dark. No headlights, no voice, just footsteps lost in the hum of insects. She felt it before she heard it. That sudden chill, that nudge in her spirit. That's when I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't break the sky open. I whispered, "Look to the left." She turned her head just slightly and saw the warm glow of a porch light down a side path. A house she had passed 1,000 times, but never thought to approach. Without knowing why, she crossed the road and walked quickly toward it. The gravel crunched louder beneath her steps. Behind her, the man froze. Light has a way of exposing what darkness tries to hide. As Ruth stepped onto the porch, the door opened. Not from her knock, but because the woman inside had just come to check on her dog. A coincidence, they both thought. But I don't deal in coincidence. I had stirred that woman's heart minutes earlier. I had placed the idea in her mind to look outside, just then, just once, and when she did, she saw Ruth, and the shape of a man retreating into the shadows. Ruth stayed on that porch for a while, pretending to talk, heart pounding. She never saw the man's face, but she felt the danger lift like smoke. The woman offered to walk her home, and she accepted. They laughed nervously, brushing it off, but inside, Ruth knew something real had happened. Something unseen had redirected her path. She lay awake that night, thinking about the moment she turned, the porch light, the sudden courage, the presence she couldn't name but had always felt. She didn't know that the man returned to his truck and drove off, empty-handed and angry, confused by the sudden turn of events. But I knew. I had shut the door before it could be opened. I had intervened, not with fire or flood this time, but with a simple light on a porch and a nudge in her spirit. That's how I often work, through what seems ordinary, a shift in direction, a passing thought, a light left on. But every moment is intentional when it comes to those I love. The enemy had followed her steps with plans of violence, but I had walked ahead of her with a different plan, one of life. She wouldn't talk much about that night. She didn't want to cause worry, or perhaps she didn't fully understand what had been avoided. But deep in her bones, she began to believe something that would grow stronger with time, that she was never really walking alone, that somehow someone was always near. Because even as she moved forward, building her life, creating beauty, helping others, storms still formed on the horizon, and the next one wouldn't come as a person or a snake or a sickness. It would come as the sky itself, spinning with fury, ready to rip everything apart. But I had already decided it would not touch her. Ruth was 35 when the sky roared louder than anything she had ever heard. The day had started like any other in late spring, humid, restless, the air sitting heavy on the shoulders of her small town in northern Florida. She had spent the morning tending her garden and the afternoon on the porch, reading scripture aloud to calm her thoughts. She felt unease in her chest, though nothing around her explained it. The birds had gone quiet. The dogs in the distance had stopped barking. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I had already begun to stir in the heavens, for I knew what was coming. The first warning came through a crackling radio in her kitchen. A storm, then a severe storm, then a tornado. Ruth looked up at the clouds and saw them bruising dark and green, swirling as if the sky had forgotten how to hold itself together. Her neighbors began calling each other. Some rushed to basements, others huddled in bathrooms. Ruth lived in an old farmhouse with no basement, no shelter, just faith. But faith, when placed in me, is enough. As the wind picked up, she could hear the sirens howling through the distant town. Her curtains lifted without touching them. The walls creaked like they were whispering secrets of fear. Ruth stood in the middle of her living room, Bible clutched to her chest, her knees beginning to bend. She wasn't just praying now. She was surrendering. "Jesus," she whispered, "if this is my time, I trust you. But if not, then send your hand." And before she finished the last word, the wind outside shifted. The tornado was coming. I watched it touch down just miles away, a monstrous funnel dragging ruin across open fields. It snapped trees like twigs, lifted trucks, tore roofs from homes as if they were made of paper. It headed straight for Ruth. Angels stood ready, but I didn't send them ahead. I went myself. As the twister reached the split in the road, where Ruth's property stood to the left, I spoke to the storm. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my hand. I simply said, "No," and the storm obeyed. The tornado split. Its path divided like water striking a rock, half tore through the woods to the north, half veered into an empty field to the south. Ruth's house remained untouched, shaken but standing. Her wind chimes jingled softly in the silence after the roar. When it passed, all she could do was fall to the ground in tears, not of fear, but of awe. The storm had come to destroy, but it had not found her. It couldn't. I had stood between her and the wind. The neighbors came later shaken and frantic. Some had lost roofs, some had trees through their windows, yet Ruth's house had not even lost a single pane of glass. "It skipped you," they said. "It changed direction last second." But I had always planned that. The storm did not skip Ruth. It saw me instead. She would always remember the sound, that deafening silence right before the roar, and she would remember my peace in the middle of it. After that day, her prayers deepened. They weren't just for protection anymore. They were prayers of gratitude, of wonder. She began to understand that what the world calls natural disasters are never outside my authority. And she knew now, more than ever, that no storm could undo what I had ordained. But storms don't only come from the sky. Sometimes they come from the road, from the things that move too fast and strike without warning. And even then, when the world says it was impossible to survive, I still speak, I still protect, I still intervene. Ruth was 48 the day time bent for her. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, not a storm, not a crisis, just one of those grey days where the sky can't quite decide between drizzle and downpour. She had finished grocery shopping in town and was driving her old truck down the winding two-lane road that led home, windshield wipers keeping rhythm like a heartbeat. The trees lining the road blurred in green and grey. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. Coming from the opposite direction, a large pickup truck lost control on the wet asphalt. The driver had been speeding, distracted, and as he came around the bend, his tires lost grip. The truck veered into Ruth's lane, fast, massive and unavoidable. She saw it too late. There was no time to turn, no shoulder wide enough to escape, no space for hesitation. In her mind, she knew, this is it. She gripped the wheel. Her heart pounded once, hard, then a stillness fell. I was already there. What happened next cannot be explained by science, not truly. The truck passed directly through where Ruth's vehicle had been, not beside it, not grazing it, through it. And yet there was no collision, no impact, no shattering glass. Ruth blinked, stunned, her hand still on the wheel, her foot easing off the gas. Her heart raced, her breath caught, but she was whole. Behind her, the other truck swerved back onto its side of the road and continued as if nothing had happened, as if time had skipped a beat. It had. I do not often rewrite the laws of physics, but in that moment, I did. I bent reality like light through water. I stretched a second into eternity and pulled her through it untouched. Why? Because her purpose had not been completed. Her story was still unfolding, and death had no place in that scene, not yet. Ruth pulled off the road and sat there for a long time. Rain tapped against the roof of her truck like soft fingers. Her hands trembled on her lap. She looked down at them, touched her chest, then whispered, "My name." This time not out of fear, but recognition. She didn't need to understand what had just happened. She simply knew. I had been there. I had done something impossible, and she was alive because of it. When she told her family, they nodded politely, trying to explain it away. Hydroplaning, lucky angles, maybe just her imagination. But Ruth knew better. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Some truths live so deep in the soul they don't need defending. She only smiled and said, "Jesus was with me." And that was enough. From that day forward, she drove a little slower, prayed a little longer, and carried an even deeper reverence for moments. How fragile they are, how quickly they can vanish, and how powerful I am in the space between seconds. She knew that the breath in her lungs wasn't just biology, it was evidence of mercy. And still, there was more to live. She would face other threats. Not always loud, not always violent. Some would wear white coats and deliver news that steals joy. But even then, when fear tried to enter through medical doors, I had already gone ahead of her. I had already rewritten what others would see. Ruth was 64 when a doctor first said the word cancer. It was a quiet morning, the kind that begins with coffee, scripture, and the soft hum of a ceiling fan. She had gone in for a routine exam, not because she felt sick, but because she believed in stewardship, of her body, of her time, of the life I'd given her. She expected the usual smile from her doctor, the gentle pat on the hand, the "You're doing well, Ruth." But that day, the room felt colder. The doctor's voice was slower. He looked at the floor before he looked at her. That was the moment everything shifted. They'd found something on the scan, a mass. Shadows where light should have been. They weren't sure yet, but the word came quickly, like a knife, wrapped in politeness. Cancer. He said it with care, but it still pierced. Ruth didn't cry. She nodded, swallowed and smiled, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had walked through too many valleys with me to forget who stood beside her now. But when she got home, the silence hit harder. She sat on her porch, Bible unopened on her lap, and stared into the horizon as if it might answer the question she was too tired to ask. "Lord, is this the end?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but I heard it. I always do. That night, while the world slept, I went to work. I stirred the heart of a young technician, someone new, someone who paid attention to details others dismissed. I led him to recheck the images, to question what others had assumed. He didn't know why he felt compelled to look again. He just felt off, that something wasn't right, that something didn't line up. The next day, Ruth received a phone call. The voice on the other end was apologetic, nervous, and surprised. "We need to run a second test," they said. It may have been a false reading. She agreed, though her heart was cautious. A week later, the second scan came back, clear, no mass, no shadow, no trace of what had once been there. "There must have been an error," they said. But I knew better. There was no error. There was an enemy with a lie, and I silenced it before it could grow. Ruth sat alone in her room with the new report in her hands. No one else was there when the tears came. They weren't loud or dramatic, just slow, reverent. Not because she had feared dying, but because she now knew with certainty I was still not finished with her. She felt it in the deepest part of her soul, that her life had once again been handed back to her, not by accident, but by design. After that, she walked with a gentler strength. She no longer rushed through her days. She took more time with people, asked deeper questions, listened longer. She began to sense what others were carrying, even when they smiled. Because she had tasted the weight of fear and been rescued from it, the misdiagnosis became a monument in her memory, not of medicine's flaw, but of my intentional mercy. Because while the world saw a clerical error, Ruth saw a God who rewrites scripts before they can play out, and her heart began to rest in a new kind of confidence. Not in what the test said, but in what I had already declared. Not yet. She had more to do, more people to love, more stories to tell. More nights under stars where she would pray for others the way she once prayed for herself. But the enemy doesn't give up, and soon he would try again, not with illness, not with storm, but with intrusion, in the stillness of the night, when evil thinks no one is watching. But I was watching, and I was ready. Ruth was 83 the night someone tried to enter her home. By then her steps were slower, but her spirit was brighter than ever. She still lived in the same little house just outside town, the one with the ivy that grew around the porch and the rocking chair that creaked with every breeze. Her days had grown quieter, but her heart had never been louder in prayer. Every morning she thanked me for life, and every night she whispered, "I'm still here, Lord. Use me if you will." She had no idea that one night her very breath would once again hang in the balance. It happened just after midnight. The town had long since fallen asleep, and even the crickets had gone silent. Ruth was tucked into bed, her Bible open on the nightstand, the lamp still on, because she always liked the soft glow as she drifted off. Outside, the moonlight barely touched the edge of her yard. That's when the man came. He moved through the darkness without a sound, gloves on his hands, a mask pulled tight across his face. He had no reason, no target, just opportunity and evil in his heart. He chose Ruth's house because it looked easy, small, quiet, alone. But he didn't know it had been surrounded by angels for decades. He didn't know that every wall had been prayed over, every room filled with my peace. He didn't know that I had already been there long before he arrived. He found an unlocked window, the one Ruth sometimes opened for fresh air on warmer nights. He pushed it up slowly, carefully. Ruth didn't wake. The house made no sound, but I wasn't silent. There, curled at the foot of Ruth's bed, was her old dog Chance, blind in one eye, nearly deaf, and long past his days of barking at squirrels. He hadn't made a fuss in years, but in that moment I stirred something in him. A jolt, a fire. The moment the window creaked, Chance leapt up with a growl that turned into a bark so loud, so fierce, it echoed through the entire house. The intruder froze. He hadn't expected a dog. He hadn't expected noise. And now, with lights flicking on in neighboring houses, and Ruth sitting up in bed, alarmed but unafraid, he fled. Fast. Vanished into the woods before anyone could see his face. But I had seen it. I knew his name, his story, his every motive, and I had stopped him before one foot could cross that sacred threshold. Ruth, confused and shaken, called the sheriff the next morning. They found footprints under the window, but nothing more. "Must have changed his mind," one deputy said. "Lucky, I guess." But Ruth wasn't convinced it was luck. She knelt in her living room after they left, hands trembling over her knees, and said, "Jesus, I know you were here. Thank you." From that day forward, she started closing that window at night, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Still, she never let fear take up residence in her home. She knew now more than ever that I guarded not just her body, but her peace, that even in sleep she was never unprotected, and that even the weakest bark, when led by me, could send evil running. Ruth lived her days quietly after that, baking for neighbors, praying for families, reading scripture to anyone who would sit long enough to listen. Her body aged, but her spirit only grew younger, because she knew she was being carried, every day, closer to the moment I had already written, not in fear, but in fulfillment. And that moment would come. Not with violence or sickness or surprise, but gently, beautifully in my time, because she had one more purpose to fulfill, one more life to witness, one more soul to welcome into the world before she would leave it. Ruth was 109 when death knocked gently, not with force, but with finality. Her body had grown frail, her hair now a silver crown that framed a face marked by nearly 11 decades of life, faith, and endurance. She lived in the same house, though others cared for her now. Her legs no longer walked through the fields, but her prayers still traveled miles. She didn't speak much anymore, but when she did, her words carried weight, as if her voice had learned to say only what mattered. The doctors had been clear. Her heart was tired, slowing, fading. They said it could be any day. Her family gathered, kissed her forehead, whispered words of love. And Ruth? She was ready. She had seen enough, loved enough, survived enough. She had faced fire, flood, illness, violence, silence, and through it all I had preserved her life. Now, as her breaths came slower and her eyes stayed closed longer, everyone around her expected the curtain to fall. But I wasn't finished. That morning, as the sun rose soft over the Florida pines, a young woman entered Ruth's room, a hospice nurse, no older than 25. She was quiet, gentle, kind. She thought she came just to care for a dying woman, but I had drawn her there for more. Because this nurse, though tender, was drowning. In fear, in doubt, in the ache of a faith she no longer believed in. Her heart was fractured, but her soul was listening. And Ruth had one more mission. Ruth opened her eyes, just slightly, just enough. And with all the strength left in her, she whispered, "He's real. Jesus is real. He kept me alive, not because I was strong, but because he is." The nurse froze. Tears filled her eyes, though she didn't understand why. Ruth didn't say another word. She didn't have to. My spirit filled the room. I touched that young woman's heart through the voice of one who had nearly passed into glory. And in that moment, her final assignment was complete. I watched it unfold with joy. I saw the seed planted in the nurse's heart, a seed that would bloom into salvation months later. Because of Ruth. Because of that whisper. Because she lived long enough to give one last testimony. And only then did I come close and kneel beside her bed. Her breathing slowed again. Her hands rested still on the blanket. I could have taken her then. Everything was ready. But I leaned close and said once more, "Not yet." And in that moment, her heartbeat steadied. Her family, surprised, said she was improving. They didn't know what had just taken place in eternity. A delay not for her sake, but for another soul. She would live one more year, not in strength, but in peace. Not to endure, but to rest, to reflect, to be honored, loved, remembered. I gave her that final year as a crown, and when her 110th birthday came, she smiled quietly, surrounded by generations that came from her, and stories that came through her. And when the time did come, not long after that final celebration, I came, not to delay, but to welcome. There was no fear, no pain, just light. I took her hand, and together we walked beyond the veil into the place I had prepared for her before her first breath. She didn't die. She came home. And this is the story of Ruth, a woman who should have died 100 times, but lived because I held her name in my hands. Fire couldn't touch her, water couldn't drown her, illness, violence, storms, shadows, none could take her before I said, "Now," because I am Jesus. I write every breath, number every day, and finish every story in perfect love. I am Jesus Christ, the beginning and the end, the keeper of every breath, the author of every life. Ruth did not leave the world by chance, nor by accident, nor by the will of sickness, time, or fear. She lived every single one of her 110 years because I held her story in my hands. She died only on the day, in the month, and in the year that I had chosen, not one moment sooner, not one moment late. Through storms and shadows I protected her. Through fear and fire I stood between her and death, and when her final breath came, it was not an ending. It was a homecoming. I took her hand, and she opened her eyes in a place where there is no more pain, no more tears, and no more fear. Now she lives forever, not just in memory, not in legacy, but truly lives. Here, in my arms, in the fullness of joy, in the eternal rest of my presence. Her story on earth has ended, but her life has only just begun. I ask that you leave a comment about my deliverances. I also ask that you subscribe to the channel. We have exciting stories of deliverances that Jesus gave to people.